You are listening to Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. I'm your host, Josh Lucas, and at Method, our vision is to connect technology with humanity for a simpler digital future. Join us as we speak with leading experts to discuss industry trends, best practices, and emerging technology that can help you and your organization craft better digital products and experiences. Hey everybody, thank you for joining. My name is Josh Lucas, and you are listening to Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. And I'm excited for you to get to hear from these two guys, very smart men in the world of digital product, Jason Rome, Cory Vogelsonger. Thank you guys for being here. Today, we're going to be talking about culture, and specifically as it relates to modern product and developing and delivering these products and experiences. If this is the first that you've heard this podcast, I would recommend you go back and listen to the first two episodes that we had, literally episodes 1 and 2. We talk about the modern product framework as we discuss it and the pillars that go into that strategy, discovery, delivery, and culture. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into culture, and Cory is implementing a lot of what we're going to be talking about with his team, and we wanted him here. And Jason, you are heading up the solutions side for Method here, and Cory is you've kind of risen in the ranks within Aaron's, and so started out as a software engineer and worked your way up to CTO right now, as well as being the GM of emerging piece of the business within Aaron's as well. So excited that you're here to hear all about how you're implementing a lot of what we're going to be discussing. And so real quick, a level set, I think when people hear the word culture, that brings up a lot of ideas as it relates to modern product. What are we going to be unpacking specifically within culture?
Yeah, it's a good place to start, and 100% right that it is this kind of umbrella term that can mean a lot of things. I think specifically here, really what we're focused on, we're looking at culture and modern product, is how do teams show up in the work every day. There's a lot that's important to culture of the benefits and the hiring practices and all that, but really, when teams show up in a meeting, how are they collaborating? What's their attitude? How do they feel about things? Are they able to take risks? And I think what's interesting for us as Method is, when I start working with someone, and you could do the same 8-week, 10-week project with two different companies, their company's culture is going to completely change how our work is received, how we work with them. And so, even though culture for a lot of people is this very invisible thing, a lot of times, like when you work across a lot of organizations, it's very apparent what it looks like. And I think culture is one of those things that doesn't get enough attention. And when it's done well, it's really an accelerator to this work, and it's everywhere. And so it really suffuses across the product lifecycle. It's the org chart, it's the ways of working, it's the collaboration, it's how leadership thinks of their employees, it's who they hire, it's how they work with partners. But I wanted Cory to come here because Cory and I did a little panel discussion last year. And during that, Cory shared his framework. I won't steal it from him, on like the values he looks for with culture. But then also, having gotten to work with your team before, I was really impressed by how your team showed up in the room, how they treated each other, how they talked to each other. And I think Cory also has like a really cool role that's like an emerging role, which is this kind of hybrid head of technology, head of product, which we're actually seeing more and more of a demand for. It's this kind of business-oriented technology leader that we see a lot of companies looking for that type of person. So we're going to let Cory's framework kind of guide our conversation today. So Cory, why don't you take it away and share with us your thoughts there?
Sure, yeah. I think the best place to start is kind of talk about why this stuff matters, because I think you got to ground yourself in the why. And to me, where I start the build up to culture is around talking about the realities of the marketplace today. We're operating, called the digital revolution, digital transformation, a fundamentally different marketplace than we did 20, 30, 50 years ago. And the big contrast I like to talk about to kind of draw that out is, you go back mid-1900s where steel is really the economic means of production, right? And it has characteristics and matters and ways of working with it that make sense when steel is how you work or is the means of production. Today, software is the means of economic production. You see that everywhere. And to reach scale in the age of steel, globally connected supply chain, humans across the globe, large scale, And today, you can get that scale with a public cloud subscription and a handful of engineers. It takes a little more than that, but you get the point. So like I start there because the ways to be successful commercially and harness the realities of the marketplace today are fundamentally different. So therefore, there's some fundamental differences in how to work and how to engage your teams and build a culture. That's always where I start. Really it's the dynamic marketplace. What's true today isn't true tomorrow. And so at the core, that dynamic sort of responsiveness needed and agility needed to operate infuses how I think about culture. And obviously, so you want to set up an environment in which is conducive to being successful in that marketplace. So let's talk a little bit about how you do that, or how I think about that. Being a modern product leader is hard. You get inundated with so many different methodologies and frameworks and ways of working and leadership principles. It can be overwhelming, kind of how they all fit together. And so what I've tried to do with how I think about building a culture is try to distill that into three sort of core principles or themes or pillars that I think really all of those techniques, methodologies, modern working methodologies ladder up to. And simple mnemonic.
And if I can jump in there, because I think one of the things that you had said that kind of struck me pretty good, the higher up you're going, there's like this expectation, whether it's self-imposed or from the outside, that you're going to be a master of all of these skills that you need, right?
Yeah.
And that's like, you have to be the best at everything. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you brought up was, no, not necessarily the case, right?
Yeah, in general, product is this, I think we've all seen the Venn diagram, where it's this intersection of all these different skills and backgrounds to be successful at product. And so, but typically somebody starts or have to start in one of those domains. I started in engineering, so I have more strength there just generally, and how the ways of working that map there. And it can be overwhelming. I did not have a design background, so getting into the design thinking process and understanding design, I'm not an expert, right? So all of us have that approach product from sort of one functional piece of the Venn diagram, but you're expected to be great at all of those things and need to be great to be successful. So a framework that I use to kind of help leaders really think about and simplify that world of all of these different methodologies is something I call safety, clarity, and urgency. So all of that modern leadership, engineering practices, design thinking, all of that really is trying to do one or more of those three things for the people doing the work. It's trying to make them more safe in doing their work. It's trying to increase clarity for them on what good looks like, how to work, how to be successful, or it's trying to create urgency because to go back to, all of these things are really, really key to operating well in this dynamic marketplace where what's true today is not true tomorrow. So safety, clarity, urgency, it's a simple mnemonic that all of those things are trying to accomplish. And I find that's an easier sort of accessible entry point for people. So before we get started, because each one of these we can go super deep on, just to make it more concrete, we all know the term MVP. What is an MVP? It is trying to urgently and safely increase your clarity around a big this or that question before you build it. Agile. It's trying to enable the teams doing the work to safely change their mind based on increased clarity of the problem space and to get there more urgently. So what I find is if you can start and ground people in those three principles, you can give them a safer sort of toehold and entry point on how to think and work, to where you've got engineers talking to you about why you got to do the DevOps thing. And really all you have to ask them is, tell me how this makes the way we work more safe, more clear, and more urgent, which they should be able to do. And if you get a good answer on that and feel good about how they're thinking about it, then that's sort of what you need to know to get started.
I think I like that you brought up the MVP, because in the work that we did together, Ethan, you guys already had an experience and a product set in market. And so technically what we were releasing wasn't an MVP, it was a new way of doing something, but like really looking at the complexities of the digital and operational side of your business, the risk profile, the risk model, and like bringing together like engineering, product, and design based on the user research to really figure out like what is a realistic incremental path where we can take risk appropriately, where, you know, because I think MVP is one of those terms that has been just overused over the last couple of years. And my favorite is like MVP 1 versus MVP 2 versus MVP 3, which is, you only get one M. And with you guys, it wasn't a true MVP. We weren't bringing something new to the market, but it was like something where we incrementally took appropriate risk that gave you guys the confidence to move forward. So, and then one other thing, you talked about steel, and I think a lot of times people want to think about Agile as a factory. But to your point about a dynamic marketplace, like, in a factory, you build the same thing over and over and over again. And in Agile, yes, you may be building a feature someone else has built or done, but rarely does the same thing go through twice in Agile. I mean, that's the intent behind it. You shouldn't be building the same thing twice. We have other issues there. But and so I think sometimes that's like a mental model. People want product development to be a factory, but it's inherently different. And so I think that mental model kind of holds people back.
I think the way I think about that and try to explain it is software is not a production problem by and large. Obviously, the production is important, but it is more of a design problem. Each thing you do is new because the context you're doing it in is different. And so that contrast of, we have a blueprint for a house, and we now need to figure out how we're gonna stamp out hundreds of those same houses. That's a production problem. That is not what software. So it lends itself to a very different way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think that is interesting and brings us to clarity. And I'm going to steal one of your stories, but like one thing that I really like that I don't see a lot of folks do. A lot of folks get so oriented, we'll talk about the differences between urgency and velocity, but a lot of folks get so focused on measuring their engineering team by the velocity a lot of times. And one of the things that you said was like, hey, I'll pull my engineers out if we don't have good work to do and send them to a location to watch how people are using the software. And I think like viewing the engineers as a part of the problem-solving team, getting smarter of solving the right thing versus only seeing their value through production is like a great cultural example that, I've seen you guys do that. I don't see a lot of other people willing to invest that time doing that. But I think it really starts with like clarity, and you already kind of alluded to like know your why. And, if you know your why, you can accomplish any how really. But I think clarity is an interesting one because it is, you mentioned connecting the dots. And when I'm meeting with new product leaders or new digital leaders that have taken a new job at the company, I see this really difficult dichotomy that they face because of this lack of clarity. And they have two big decisions. One is, all right, I'm coming in as a product leader at a company. Do I go attack the one burning project that's on the top of everyone's mind that is struggling? Or do I get my arms wrapped around my whole entire portfolio and make sure it's all aligned to business outcomes? And like very rarely can you do both. But then at the same time, I see a lot of these folks coming in saying like, oh, I have a way of work clarity problem. I don't know where my work in progress is. We don't have definitions of done. We don't have definitions of ready. And so leaders have to decide, do I go after the portfolio or do I go after like the big project? And then they have to decide, do I get my strategy right or do I get my production and execution right? And that's not a one-person job when someone takes a new role. And so I think with clarity, it's both why are we working? What are we working on? Who's working on what? But it's also a how are we working? How do we drive flow? And so I'd be curious, I'd love to share some techniques, but like in terms of increasing clarity, what have you done to help with that? What's worked, what hasn't?
Okay, let's talk about clarity for a second. So real quick intro on it is, I use an analogy of a journalist. The journalist toolkit, every investigative journalist is the 5 W's and an H, which is what, where, when, why, and then how. And so when I talk to a product leader about this, it's you're an investigative journalist trying to discover the change that will make the biggest impact in the way that your company expresses value. And so it stands to reason that if you're a journalist, that same toolkit works. And so those give you, so all of those questions, what, where, when, why, and how, really help frame or decompose the problem in a way that you can think about clarity of why. Do they really understand why this matters? And what can I do to help there? Clarity of what. Do they know what done looks like? Do we have a way to evaluate success that's generally objective and resolves the true false? Have we aligned around what that looks like from an outcome perspective? So you can go down the list. And so I can dive into any of those. Well, all of them matter. So if we talk about the what, because I think this is one that's, really fundamental to this style of work is you hear this outcomes over outputs, thinking about end state. There's lots of different ways to think about it. But I think that's really key, is expressing and articulating your work in an outcome-oriented way. So it's less build this thing, but create this change in your business. And a good, really simplistic example is I'm a leader of a group of people, and we come upon a river, wandering, and I say, I will build a bridge, and they build a bridge. But if I had described the work, and that's expensive and timely and all that, but if I had described the work as I want to be standing on the other side of the river, not soaking wet, then that unlocks the people who have closer to the action context to say things like, oh, well, the river narrows a half mile upstream and there's a land bridge and we can just walk up there. And there's lots of other cultural things about how do you cultivate people to speak up and say what's on their mind, which we can talk about that too. But essentially, so the clarity on the outcome, that's where I start with a lot of this stuff. Because outcome I view as kind of the lingua franca of all the different expertises and specialists that are needed to deliver a modern product. So it's the thing that everybody can understand. Oh, if you want to do that, the data scientist has a particular way that they need to think about that. The engineer does, the product person does. So I always start there, ground there. So I think the best place to start with clarity. One other one on clarity that I want to talk about for a minute too that I think is really important is the clarity of when. Dates. Let's talk about dates. Dates are always a problem in our space. And so something we've done in a practical way, dates are ambiguous. It could be a deadline. Miss this date and the business dies. It could be a what I call a target, which is, we'll have something to work towards, but if we don't get it, we're closer than we were before, and we just want progress. And so dates are very ambiguous and can be really problematic in our world because it can influence people to do the wrong work in the name of hitting a date. But dates are also important because it's a key way in creating urgency. So what I find, and like a simple practical technique, is to talk about what are you hiring that date to do, to use the jobs to be done framework, and create a language and a taxonomy around what kind of date you're talking about when you do the work. And there are things in our space that are you have to hit it. It is a hard and fast deadline. Think big marketing campaign or product launch. You are going to make choices optimizing the date, and you should. However, most times, frankly, in my world at least, it's we want to get further down the field, evaluate where we're at, and assess sort of what the next incremental work looks like. But we want to be urgent and we do it, so we want a target to work towards. I call those targets, which is about basically creating an enabling constraint, a forcing function for teams to think smaller, which I think is key to product. So anyway, that's on the clarity of when, creating some sort of taxonomy, and you can come up with your own language, but not every date is not like another. And giving the teams the clarity to do that helps them do better work.
Dates are really interesting, especially for me as a consultant, where our work is very often contractually constrained by certain dates. But when I'm working with a client and we're working on scoping something, I do tell them hey, there's two ways we can do this. Is you give me a date and I'll give you scope, or you give me scope and I give you the date. And I think in products sometimes a lot of people do want to throw the date out with Agile, but that's kind of one of the realities of the enterprise is you have commitments, you have budget cycles. And so I think that's just a sign of maturity over time is the respect to have for dates. But I think the anti-pattern of dates is the classic business asks IT for a date, IT pads it by 2 months because they don't want to get beat around, and they can have a good conversation about that.
I call that the trust tax. You're paying a very high lack of trust tax.
Yeah. Well, and then even, when I am working with a client and I'm coaching one of our teams, I say, like, contextualize our work in their dates, not in ours. Like, a lot of times our project dates are arbitrary from a start point to an end point, which don't match the client's, ultimate like release. And so it's kind of contextualizing our journey and their journey is really important. But going back to the clarity on outcomes, one of the things that I do, which is just, kind of the investigative journalism, is just asking the right questions. OKRs are rising in popularity sometimes, but I see a lot of people write OKRs that are so far away from the product team that there's just this huge gap, and they end up being like P&L OKRs that the product team doesn't really be able to influence. And so, like, writing good outcomes and goals is really important. Like, my general rule of thumb is, if you give me a goal, I want to be able to ask how. And if I have to ask how like more than 3 times to get to like an epic or a feature, your goal is probably more of a lagging indicator than a leading indicator of something the product team can influence. But then I do the same thing with the product team is, if you give me an epic and I have to ask why more than like 3 or 4 times, like, let's reset on if we are pursuing the right goal for something. And I think with some of this clarity on outcomes, I think it's one of those things that if you give it just a little time, there's only so many ways to measure business success. And so just by sitting and looking at your backlog and everything that's in it and just asking yourself why 2 or 3 times on each of those, like, you'll arrive at your strategy pretty quickly. Now, whether it's the right strategy or not is a different question. But, I think, I forget where I read that one time, but like, it's impossible not to have a strategy. Like, you always have a strategy, whether it's written or not. And so by like taking inventory, setting a why for everything, and then just taking a critical look at it is really important. And so, yeah, I think that clarity of starting with the why and orienting on it, it doesn't have to be perfect almost, but like, I find it's one of those things that people just don't spend enough time talking about it, and you just end up with being this kind of wheel that, you just keep spinning and spinning and digging and digging and digging deeper.
What you find to me is there's this gap between these really coarse-grained investor deck kind of goals that digitally transform the business, the folks doing the work, and this particular backlog item, and there's a real gap in there. And if you can work to clarify that connection, traversing up and down, it's a recursive problem. Like, it's not a stop and we're going to do it. It's actually part of the work I use, because generally people know the right things to work on. My point is, they're working on things, but they can't connect them up to those higher level goals. And if you find ways to it's just a hierarchy or a tree. And if you find a way to connect those in a way that they can speak to and understand, it can refine their work and refine the top level goals in ways that I think is really valuable.
I think to your point about the river is like, the other thing that I think clarity of why discussion happens is like, I read a great book recently called The Crux, and it talks about really nailing your challenge, but it explores this idea of like action alternatives. And so I think a lot of times without asking that why and having I want to get to the other side of the river conversation, teams often get blinders of the ability to explore action alternatives. And I think especially in digital, to your point around the bridge, like, there is a lot of really cheap options to do things well. Like, a lot of problems can be solved by better content, better comm strategy, like better change management, like stuff that is a lot cheaper than replatforming, launching a new product. And so I think, because, a lot of these product cultures, engineering cultures are focused on the amount of things they build instead of the impact of what they build, and we're probably starting to get into safety now, but being able to kind of question that why and assess that and have people empowered to do that, and that's why I wanted to talk about clarity first, because I think safety and, and urgency flow from clarity first. Yeah.
I just want to recap here for the folks who are maybe a little bit newer to the conversation, like myself. As you're moving into thinking through like project work, as whatever that may be for you and your organization, why, where, what, how, when, like, that's really like you're distilling. The question of clarity comes down to clearly defining each of those, why they're important, and let's make sure we're all on the same page. And everyone should be able to answer those questions for us all to move forward together effectively.
Well, it's really a frame in which to think about how, as a leader, my job is to incrementally increase clarity on all of those dimensions. And it's just a mental model and a thought starter for the team and for you to really ask yourself, does this team really understand why? And how might I get them to understand why more? And a lot of that is, there's a concept I use called thinking out loud, which you articulate, you externalize how you arrived at things instead of saying the things that you got at. And by doing that, that's a simple technique that teams can do to increase clarity, increase collaboration, all those things, increase safety. But so it's not necessarily you need to answer. Yes, somebody needs to answer those questions, but it's really a way for you to challenge yourself and the team to go, where are we missing the mark on this, and where can we improve? Because all of those things, all ships rise from improving clarity across all those sort of aspects.
To that point, though, sometimes getting to a point of disagreement is as valuable as getting to a point of agreement. Like when I'm working with a client sometimes, and there's tension or there's ambiguity in it, I'll just put my understanding down of like what I know today on a page or two. And, at that point, I'm just as excited about a no as a yes, because now we're having the right conversation. And I think our president, Tim, calls it the right of first draft. And so I think just the power of putting a draft in front of people of what the strategy is drives a much better conversation than putting a blank sheet of paper in front of a lot of people.
Well, and what's interesting, this was like early on when I first started working with you. I remember this. I can't even remember what the conversation was, but I remember walking into the room. I was new to this whole ecosystem of work, and walking in with Jason, and you just threw here's what we're doing, and they threw it up on the board. And I'm sitting there going like, why would you do it like that? Like that's not the right. And it's like, great. How should we do it?
A lot of this stuff sounds very abstract and not practical. So I want to try to talk about some practical things we actually do. And one of the techniques that I use and try to teach on my team is we write a lot of one-pagers, just like a single-page document when we start out an initiative that really highlights clearly what we're trying to do and why in an outcome-oriented way, some measurable ways in which we can evaluate success, and then externalize or articulate the implicit assumptions and then kind of key constraints you got to work within. So a simple one-page document, and then what I'll do is, like when we have a meeting to start, we read it together. We take 5 minutes, everybody reads it, and then that facilitates such a better conversation to where you can get people to go, why did you say that? Everybody sees the problem slightly different, the why is slightly different, and so that's a way that I find to really activate a lot more people in the discussions. Again, they got to be safe. They got to feel safe to do that, which we can talk about. But just a real practical technique is just, if you're a product leader and you don't feel like your teams really are getting, there's like these implicit sort of disagreements that aren't being surfaced, write something for people to respond to really simply, and it'll start a conversation.
Well, and that might be a good transition into safety because you both of you have referenced that a little bit here. So as if we can transition into that subject, we're talking about not just safety as far as safely moving the project forward, but safety for your people to speak and act and live into their roles with confidence, right?
Yeah, there's two sides of the safety coin and how I think about it. There's this concept of psychological safety, which I think most probably have heard of, but in general, that is this like true feeling of organizational permission to be candid, to say what's on your mind, to take risk and not feel all the, potentially negative consequences that can come from.
Got to have the right answer. Like I can't speak unless I know exactly what everyone needs to hear.
So that's critically important for all this stuff to work is putting an emphasis on how do you work towards getting a higher degree of psychological safety. The other side of the coin you mentioned is what I call working safely, which is practices, techniques, methodologies that allow you to work in a much safer way. So I'll start there, talk a little about that, because, and this is where it can really get overwhelming to somebody that doesn't have an engineering background when you start talking about continuous delivery and DevOps and Lean and all of these sort of really deep concepts. Their entire job is to make it safer for the team to deliver change into the environment. And it does that in a few ways. So let's talk about continuous delivery. Sort of the anti-pattern that continuous delivery is fighting is that like quarterly release, yearly release, that you like struggle to get deployed. You're on the phone all night with all the people in operations, and then it breaks, and you have no idea why. It could be a line of code you wrote. So it's much safer, and there's lots of statistical and scientific evidence to support this that I won't quote, but there's lots of books about it. Go read Accelerate. But that working in smaller increments is the best risk reducer. So limiting your batch size to a week's worth of work, engineering your processes to work in smaller increments, making it cheaper to deploy, inherently makes it safer because one, you automate everything, and so everything's repeatable. And two, if something breaks, you're only a week out from whatever change you made, so it's much easier to find. So, but all that's about safety. I just told you what continuous delivery is when your engineers talk about it, and it's about making it safe so you can work in smaller increments. Another aspect of safety and the working safely, which we can show how this applies to all the disciplines, is design thinking. There's a big component of design thinking that's about, going to the place, talking to the user, talking to the customer, understanding the customer, and that be a key input. A lot of organizations don't let the people doing the work talk to the customer. So how can you make it safe for you might screw up kind of reasons, default to no kind of reasons. So how do you make it safer for your engineers and your people doing the work, designers, product leaders, to engage with the people who will use what they do? One thing I think you mentioned is a technique we do when we're working on a key initiative. I will make all the people that want to work on it, which it's the fun stuff, essentially secret shop whatever we're going to do. And so on Monday, actually, we're starting to launch something new. We want to reassess the old. And so 2 engineers on my team actually coded in yesterday basically a short circuit switch. So when they apply, they get a particular treatment, and they're going to go sit in the store and do it and see the experience. So that is how we work. That, if I describe that from, to certain audiences in certain corporate environments, you're like, what are you talking about? You can't do that. How do you make it safe? That's safety on that side. So I wanted to say it's not just engineering safety. I wanted to use that as an example of like in the design space, continuous discovery is about making it safe too.
I want to touch on both of those, and I'll work with clients in the SaaS space that deploy on-prem products that are really complex to configure. And so you actually don't want to be released to your clients every week in that case, because you create churn, or in the healthcare space that has significant approval processes you have to go through for every new release. And so I think one thing that's really key is deployment and releasing are 2 different things. And I think a lot of people see the deployment and the release as the same thing, and you can still work in small batch size, even with less frequent deployments.
And you can probably find a way to release it to a small set of users.
Yeah, so canary releases, dark releases, a lot of people don't do that well, but I was working with a client recently, and one of the things that came out in the assessment we did was, hey, we're getting into our hardening phase pre-release, and we're ending up with really complex test cases and regressions that, we're having to make go, no-go decisions to hit our date, going back to your other point, with really limited information. And what we assessed was that, the way they were structuring their sprint cycles in the work is, going into that release cycle or that increment, the engineers were taking the 1 point, the 2 point story points early on. And so the 5 point, the 8 point, like these kind of bigger, hairier things were getting pushed towards later sprints, which did not set their QA team up to be able to test those well. And so like a really simple change that like isn't necessarily, no product management prioritization framework is going to tell you like prioritize your most difficult to test features early in a sprint. But like one of the things that we did to create safety was he said like, hey, let's take the stuff that's hardest to test and put that early in our build cycle to give the QA team the time they need to test that. And so like it's a really subtle change that makes a huge difference, because you've kind of eaten your risk up front and you've front loaded the risk of a release. And just those like little things can really change safety, where you're still doing your CI/CD and you're getting a build done, earlier, even if you're not releasing it. And so I think that's a really key thing that you brought up. And then on the psychological safety, I'm not a big fan of the term fail fast. I think it's overused. And in our culture, when you go to school, when you go to college, failure is pretty much the worst thing possible. And then you start a job in product and they're like, fail fast. And you're like, I have no idea how to do that. But if instead you use the term calculated mistakes, which I think like, unless you are a leader with a very large budget making big decisions, anything you do likely is not going to be considered a business failure. The most you can do is make calculated mistakes, but that language of calculated mistakes encourages you to learn. And going back to clarity, like when we reach that point where we have a disagreement, and I was doing a go-to-market workshop with a client yesterday, and after they got their strategy, they're like, well, now what do we do? And they all had kind of different implementation. And the question I like to ask is, what would have to be true for this strategy to be right? And so they realized, well, we've got this conversation with this client next week. We can ask these 3 or 4 questions to kind of validate this direction. And that question of what would have to be true to be right is really powerful, because you as a team go from debating your opinions to building experiments. And you can assess, like, can we do this with user testing, or do we have to put something in prod and get results? And just that small switch just changes the level of collaboration of safety, because now, like, you and I are debating how to validate one of us is right, not who is right. And I think that's like the perfect example of safety, is really how teams discuss and collectively take risks as a team in a collaborative way.
And you also mixed in some clarity there, because that discussion of what would need to be true is a clarity facilitating topic where you can tease out assumptions, implicit assumptions that somebody might not be saying, that create some subtle nuance in how you might evaluate success at the end, which is very important to get out at the outset, because then you can influence the work that way. So if you don't get that right, the rest of the stuff is really, really hard. But I have a team that tells me I'm wrong all the time. That's a good thing, but it's indicative of the culture that we've built. And what that speaks to is tapping into intrinsic motivation is the key to urgency and safety and all these things. And so all the techniques I do about getting people out to see their work, to the way we work, is about them being owners of the work, to tap into intrinsic motivation rather than this external, like, I need to do this or I'm gonna get in trouble.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, that's also speaks to, you don't have to be the smartest person in the room for every single question. That's right? Like, I'm sure, I think a lot of people in the room looking at you are like, early on, probably thinking, can I say this? Is this safe for me to do this? Like, I don't know if he's right. But once that trust is established, I'm thinking from your perspective, man, this probably gives you much more confidence too, knowing that, hey, if I'm wrong, they're going to let me know. And like, it's reaffirming that when you are ready to move forward, you're moving forward with the right information.
It's 100% true. I have my leadership team. We have diverse people with strong opinions, and that gets us to a better outcome. And really what I put the emphasis on, there's rarely times where I'm like, it has to be this way. Frankly, I don't think I say that at all. But oftentimes I just look for alignment. Did I facilitate a conversation to where it's clear what we're trying to do and why? If you've read Ray Dalio, the Principles book, there's this concept of this believability weighted decision making. So, if the people who have the expertise in the thing we're talking about, so if it's an engineering sort of discussion, do the 2 or 3 engineers, and if I can answer that yes, and I can answer, have I done a good job in articulating why this matters and what done good looks like? That's the answer to me. That's typically all I need. But that only works if you've built to a point where they feel comfortable saying what they think.
What do you think what are the culprits that you have seen that keep that from happening?
That discourage psychological safety? Consistency in how you show up is super key. One of the biggest is a blame culture.
That's number one, for sure.
You did it wrong, as opposed to, we didn't get the result we wanted. Let's inspect and talk about why, and then figure out what we're going to do next. But that's a difference that is really key. And the main thing with cultivating psychological safety that every leader needs to remember is, like, it takes a long time to build, 20 to 40% of your team to actually do it, and you can ruin it in a second. I don't think I've ever like yelled at my team, and I just don't do it because it's so damaging. Instead, so I engage them as leaders. A lot of the language I use is, you understand what we're trying to do, what would you do? Because what you'll end up a lot with is like, when you get this culture, there's a lot of just like, this sucks, we should do it this way, do it this way. And then you go, you know what we're trying to do, I trust you, what should we do? That creates that ownership, which ultimately creates intrinsic motivation, which helps them speak up. And it's this sort of self-fulfilling thing. So yelling, just being like inconsistent to where they don't know on a day-to-day basis who they're going to get when you show up. I do, and this is maybe a style thing, I try to make the work fun. I introduce a lot of levity into how I work. You've seen that. And a lot of that is I enjoy it. I mean, I do it a lot, so I want to have fun, but it's also to try and humanize me and what we're doing, and like to take some of the weight off it. We're couches and TVs.
Well, and also like, but digital is the coolest job there is. And like, it should be fun. Like if it's not fun, like there's other jobs that, you know, and so the blame culture, and I've seen you guys having fun. It is real, because I think a blame culture leads to a fear culture. And I think one thing for leaders that I would say is that, like, you know, if you're a leader, people will often be on their best behavior when you're present. So just like if you ran a call center, you'll QA calls once in a while. Like you almost need to secret shop a stand-up, like an increment planning, like a strategy session with your teams. And because for me, when I'm a lot of this safety, I'm looking at collaboration of how people treat each other. And so if I joined a stand-up, how does your product design and engineering team, how do they collaborate? If I join a meeting between two teams that need to work together to get something out, you know, how do they treat each other? Are they trying to put the pressure on one or the other of them to deliver so that they're kind of covering themselves if it doesn't go right? If I join your team meeting with the legal team to approve new copy, how do they show up? And so I think as a leader, you almost need to like audit some of these meetings, because I worked with one client where we did a workshop and the head of engineering said, we have a fear culture. And the head of product was like, no, we don't. We've never fired anyone. We've never had that. And they said, well, it's not a fear of not doing well. It's a fear of not having their ideas listened to if they speak up. And so we uncovered this like kernel of like being able to speak up, because to your point, you know, a lot of people will wait until after the meeting to back channel and disagree with something. And so, you know, and you kind of, with your one pager, kind of similar to what Amazon does with the PRFAQ press release, Amazon has this saying around disagree and commit. And so it's okay to disagree as long as you kind of commit to a path and have clarity on why you've committed to that and are able to move forward. But to Cory's point, people will stay silent or not say something in a meeting and then immediately downplay that. And we're going to talk about urgency at some point, but like unmade decisions or lack of alignment on a decision that has been made is the number one killer of productivity and product from what I've seen.
Kind of to what you're alluding to, that I'm hearing also, is that the problem that you just laid out, back channeling and everything, is you run the risk of potentially everyone thinking they're aligned when they're not, and now you're going back and you're undoing everything that they might be. Yeah, and it's like you can't sidestep it. Like it's going to come out somewhere.
When something is red and you're behind, it is too late to fix that issue. Like you have to reset. Like recovering from red when you're behind is a demonstration of culture, because nothing goes from green to red. It goes through many shades of yellow. But if people aren't empowered to speak up and say like, hey, this is too much scope. Hey, we're missing our dependencies. Like, hey, we're not aligned. Hey, we don't have all the requirements. We don't have the environments we need. Like you want people to bring that up, and which I think is kind of, now we're getting into urgency a little bit as well here. So they're all connected. But you know, funny enough, I'm kicking off one of these assessments with a client later today, and you know, it's funny. The number one thing they asked me going into this assessment was, how do we create a better sense of urgency for people to raise issues up earlier when they are blocked? Which is so funny because they've framed that as urgency, but Cory and I have framed that just as much as safety here, and so it kind of shows that connective tissue. Yeah. And so, you know, to me, and one of them sitting on the shelf here, so I'm being incepted, but, you know, Kim Scott, Radical Candor, talks about being direct and doing it from a place of caring in terms of like a really good culture. And I think that's one of the best books written on instant, meaningful feedback that comes from a place of caring. And then I think the other book, Carol Dweck, who writes about the growth mindset. And I think that's another really good way of looking at psychological safety is a growth mindset. And I forget where I read it, but someone once said, like, one of the jobs of product management is just to make sure each release is less worse than the one before. And so, like, that's kind of like what we're all trying to do is, like, just every day it's a little bit better. And, like, how cool to have a job like that where, you get to get better every day and do work better and the result is better every day. But, like, going back to the clarity, if your team is just focused on the output, they're not going to have that growth mindset because they're only ever going to be measured based on how much they did, not if they did the right thing. And so that's where, all these things are really connected. So I'd be curious thoughts.
Okay, so we've talked about safety, we've talked about clarity. Let's jump into urgency, because when I don't think I'm unique in this. I think a lot of people hear the term urgency and that's a bad word in some cases. Urgency oftentimes can be perceived as, oh my gosh, we have to move fast because something's wrong. But that's not what we're talking about here, right?
No, that's what I'm talking about. No, yeah, you're right. That is not what we're talking about.
So let's unpack that a little bit. When we're talking about urgency, why is it important, and what should that look like in a healthy environment?
You want more clarity on the why?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so that, just to go back to where I started, is the dynamic marketplace. The rate of change in the marketplace is why urgency matters. All your competitors are getting to market. They're new emerging competitors and changing the environment in which you're operating at a rate we've never seen, and it's continuing to increase. So you need to move quickly. That is not, though, to your point, chaos. There's a way to do that. There's a good way to do that and a bad way to do that. And I think the way you start is urgency towards what, and this gets back to outputs versus outcomes. Urgency towards achieving an outcome, a change in your business environment. Not we built a thing, we changed a metric, as an example. So got to start there. It's about urgency to impact, and that flips your brain. So how do you get to the right answer faster, or a more right answer, to kind of go back to what you were saying, a more right answer faster, not just get something done faster. On time, on budget isn't enough, which is typically going back to the old IT model, how we talked about things. Those are still constraints, but they are not your ultimate success. Two sort of aspects to this. One is around creating an urgency mindset on the team, because nothing speeds up the work more than the people really giving a shit about achieving an outcome. That's about ownership. That's about how do you tap into intrinsic motivation. There's a book by Daniel Pink called Drive that speaks about how do you tap into intrinsic motivation to where they wake up and like want to do the work because they're excited about the work. Great book, by the way. So how do you cultivate an intrinsic mind? I basically try to take the net out from under them. And there's a lot of learned helplessness, frankly, in corporate America, to where like I can't do this thing because they said so, or that would be risky. And so a lot of what I'm trying to do is just is strip away as much as we can the entire value stream and how work is created. They own. By and large, and can influence directly. That's why I send them into the store, so they can feel what their customers feel in the crafty experiments that they thought was a good trade-off at sitting down. So that's a biggie. Just getting them to care about the work. Automatically, they find a way to get there faster. In the right way. Again, it's got to be about to impact. So another thing I do that is maybe a little unique is I'll sit down and walk an engineering team through the P&L. Understanding the economic engine and how we make money helps them make better decisions that get you to the answer faster. So a lot of that is just, it goes to clarity, but it's an urgency play too, because it gets them thinking about the clearest path. They know the clearest path. I don't. I know where we're trying to get to, or have different contexts. So number one is just getting them to act like owners, be intrinsically motivated on that mindset approach. Certain people do well in that environment, and certain people don't want to work that way. And so culturally, you need to figure out how to make that important to where the right people rise up, hiring, promotions, that kind of thing. And then the other is just how do you create urgency in your ways of working? And this is where lean thinking really plays a big part, which is essentially like really take a continuous improvement mindset to eliminate things that don't directly drive value in your organization, in the way your organization sees it. Continuous delivery does that. It gets there faster. Where, actually a good topic here to talk about this is there's, we're name dropping a lot of books, but here's another one. Mark Schwartz wrote a book called The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy. He's got this hokey sort of narrative thing in it, but it's the underlying message is really, really good, which is bureaucracy in itself isn't good or bad. It's simply the rules in which work gets done. It has gotten a bad name because of the way it's implemented, which is bloated and coercive and kind of default to close. Bring me your changes and I will deem them good or not. Turns out all of these automation techniques, CI/CD, actually getting out and understanding what value is, allows you, all of that is a risk reducer, and that you'll get to the impact faster, you'll work in smaller increments. So taking a lean mindset and thinking about bureaucracy, the rules in which work gets done, and instead of making it coercive and bloated, make it lean and enabling and learning to where it's really focused on value. It enables the teams to where they feel like they have some ownership in the work instead of some nameless, faceless body deeming. I kind of view the emperor and what was that, Gladiator, where it's kind of like this thumbs up, thumbs down. Yeah, that's very disenfranchising. So, and then learning. So like they get smarter over time. And so automation and fast feedback, all of those things sort of connect to getting urgent in a way that maps to how you work. So what I'm trying to say is look at how your work gets done and try to influence good bureaucracy, not bad bureaucracy, and have those conversations with your team. Do we really need a change advisory board? If we've got a change advisory board that meets once a month, how are we going to deploy every day?
Well, and if I can interject, and I'd be curious your thoughts on this too,
I have
Jason.
thoughts.
Tell me all your thoughts. So as you're describing this, the bureaucracy that oftentimes finds its way into corporate America, and then this idea of like the emperor thumbs up, thumbs down mentality, and this is all framed around the idea of urgency. I'm assuming this is commonly what actually hinders urgency, not just because it bottlenecks it, but because if I know I'm working towards one person's final yes or no being the arbiter of whether this moves forward, I'm going to take more time to make sure that I'm getting the right answer. And oftentimes I already have it, but I'm second guessing. We're going back through. It's slowing down the process to get there.
Absolutely. And you also get this malicious. So if we anchor on the right outcome, and if we agree that the people doing the work closest to the action know the best way to get to a particular outcome, if you feed them in a clear way, it creates this learned helplessness. If there's this over there that I don't understand, and so you get a lot of like, well, they want me to do it this way, so I'm gonna do it this way, even though it's stupid, and that zaps urgency.
I do see a lot of that, like culturally, companies that pride themselves on, when velocity is that number one metric, that they pride themselves on how much they do. And so I think a lot here, and we're kind of dancing around the E word and the A words, which is empowerment, autonomy, accountability here. So I want to touch on those. But, I think the first thing for me, and I mentioned this earlier, urgency for me comes down to how well an organization makes decisions. Is the number one thing. And I think as leaders, having a good framework for what decisions you want to be involved in. Teresa Torres in Continuous Discovery Habits talks about assumption mapping, which I think is really important. And then, Amazon has this concept of one-way versus two-way doors and decision reversibility. And so like knowing the big decisions that are like highly unreversible, that if that decision is made, it's going to be hard to untangle that. That's where you want to be as a leader. Like, you don't want to be approving every design, small copy changes, small feature prioritization. I see people that are releasing in a quarter, yet they have leaders reprioritizing sprints where all the releases are going to come the same day anyways. And so it's all going to get to the end state at the same time. Like, why do you need to be involved? And the things that kills teams is when they don't feel empowered, again, this learned helplessness, and they have a once a month committee. like you're talking a 4-week lag time for a decision to be made, and you just end up, I always tell people like, engineering capacity is your hero. You do not get that time back once it passes. And so anytime when your team is not working well or working on the wrong thing, you will never get that time back. And so, I think that decision making, and so like one thing I like to do is, and I'm staring at Team of Teams, and Cory told me we have 2 copies here. So, but it goes back to that, I equate unmade decisions kind of to like the maybe RSVP on Facebook, which is useless. Like, do I count you or do I not count you? And so I think a lot of us treat decisions like that, where we go in, we present 2 options or 3 options. And I guarantee you, if you go into a half-hour meeting with a large group of people and present 3 options, you are going to walk out of that meeting with 3 or more options for that decision. Versus if you walk into that meeting and say, this is the recommendation, here is the alternative, and you say, change my mind, you're going to walk out with a decision. And so like making sure like decisions are kind of like a lever, it's always pushed in one direction or the other. It's never like sitting in a neutral position. And that way the team, so I love the phrase, strong beliefs loosely held. And that way you're always like, this is our current belief. We are willing to change our mind quickly when presented with better evidence. And, talking about culture, I think it's important to have very little ego in this work, because I think people get caught up in like the sunk cost fallacy of like, oh, we put all this work into this prototype, we should take it forward even when users are saying no. So like that decision making is the best example of how urgent a company's culture is. And then Cory, you talked a little about kind of automating feedback loops. And I think if you look at even further back from like the DevOps handbook and the Phoenix project, the Unicorn project, which are all kind of harken back to this book called The Goal, which came out, and it's about kind of warehouse and process automation. And the guy is this physicist kind of turned MBA who wrote this book. But his whole thing is looking at find your bottleneck versus locally optimizing, and which I think is such an important thing for teams of like, and the way I always equate it is I tell a team like, hey, if I gave you $1 million tomorrow, where's the money going to get stuck in your process? And fixing those places where money gets stuck first versus everything else. And so you talk about DevOps, and I think sometimes people want to build the pipeline of their dreams for the sake of doing it, whether it's going to drive more speed and urgency for them or not. And so I think it's really important to have a sense of like where the blockage is. And to be honest, a lot of times the blockers, like for me, a lot of like engineering issues and design issues always have upstream effects on like poorly made or poorly articulated decisions and poor clarity. And so, and then, so then we finally get to that empowerment. And one thing I want to talk about with empowerment is, I think it's unfortunate with Agile, you've kind of lost really good project and program management sometimes, because there's a lot of work that exceeds the ability of a product manager to manage when you are doing product work. And it's what we call complex coordination. So when you have 2-3 product teams working together, when they have to work with an ops team or a bunch of third-party vendors, that's really hard to do. And I think sometimes when you have program management in those functions, you end up with program management playing the role of like a weatherman, where they're reporting on what's happening, but they're not handing out umbrellas. And so having a group of people that are accountable in the work to solve problems versus report on problems, who have a clear mandate to work across multiple teams and unblock things, is really important. And I feel like in all the new Agile ways of working, like that's kind of a role that's been killed off. And you end up with 3 or 4 product managers and like an ops manager across these different teams, kind of like warily negotiating with each other, where it's not clear who is empowered to make decisions. And that's when you end up with escalations and purgatory, because like, going back to clarity, they all have 5 different goals that they think they're moving towards because of that. So I don't know, I'd be curious if you guys see that when you have multiple teams.
That is the hardest thing, is coordinating across teams, because for lots of reasons, architecture reasons, ways of working within the teams. What I think is at the root of everything you're talking about is really the fundamentals of lean thinking. And you talk about decision, speed of decision, which I'm with you. Increasing the speed and quality of the decision is like of making a decision and having a decision made is something. It's like the number one thing, without me seeing your organization, that you can probably do. But I think the more broader sort of thematic point in that is, and the way I engage with my teams on all the stuff you were just talking about, is wait cycles kill urgency. Where is the work not moving? Where is it? I put a ticket to in a system and I'm waiting on a response. Find a way to eliminate that wait cycle. And that's lean thinking at its core. And so sometimes that's the decision making upstream. Sometimes that's, well, we have a manual step in our deployment process, and we need Bob. He's the only one that can do it. But if you just take that, like, where's the work? Where does work sit? Because what that does is really at the basis of all this is collective ownership of the goal, not the step in the process. And what you're trying to do is engender through intrinsic motivation, collective ownership of I'm successful not when I completed my task, but when we've achieved the outcome. And they feel safe to take risks if you empower them. And all the stuff we've already talked about, if we're very clear that that's the way we want to work, they'll find those bottlenecks and find a way to engineer around it, process around it, and then that increases the clock speed of your organization to where you get to market faster.
And going back, circling that back all the way to clarity, it's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of like an enterprise Kanban board, because you ask most leaders of like, what's going on across all of your teams, and they're going to have to cobble together 8, 9, 10 PowerPoint slides, like a couple different Jira views. Maybe they send you a roadmap, but like a roadmap is what you want to achieve at certain milestones. It's not where things are. And so I think having that enterprise Kanban view, seeing where things are getting stuck, understanding like putting WIP limits in process for things. Because I think one of the things with urgency as well is
do less, finish more.
Yeah, exactly. And so a lot of people, they're really good at starting stuff. And if you really aggregate all of the things you have in flight, you will be surprised at how much stuff is sitting in ready to be released or like dev done or waiting for QA. And Cory mentioned this earlier, but a really important point of like, and I think David and I talked about this too, is like measuring done by the accomplishment of a goal and making sure that's the last step in your Kanban board. I've talked to clients that they'll have code sit ready to be deployed that doesn't go to a client, that doesn't get sold to a client or doesn't go to a user for months. It's just sitting and it's deployed, but they weren't able to like take that last step. But like, who knows about that in the organization? Like, who's watching that? Is that the dev team's job? Is that the product team's job? And so you end up with this gap between like deployment and success measurement that no one really owns, because everyone's already on to the next thing before they're looking at the previous thing. And so like, I think that's another thing with it's not urgency, but it's like the urgency to make sure what work did it, and that you have the analytics and the measurement techniques, and like, it goes back to clarity, but yeah.
Going back to where we talked about software is not, the people want to use the mental model of a production line and product. I agree with you that that's the wrong mental frame for 90% of the process, but an area that I think you can put a production mindset and a KPI that says, make this number bigger, is the lead time of a commit to it being deployed. If you put an emphasis on that, which is, or at least explore that, this change was committed, how long on average does a single change reach production? And if you engage your teams on getting better at that problem, they will solve a lot of waste and lack of urgency process problems, whether that's through CI/CD or what have you. That's a place where the production metaphor, I think, really maps well. But it is misused quite a bit. So.
Like even, looking at the CI process, not just as a production, but that's also your like QA. It's kind of, you open up the shoe and like the shoe was approved by like this person. Like, I think a lot of people just see like their DevOps is like getting the code integrated versus like using it to do really good root cause analysis on like what's not working, and this kind of concept of like built-in quality as part of that. Because that's one of the questions we ask in our survey is like, hey, our builds are fast and we're able to do a root cause analysis when they don't work. And that's actually one of the questions that I've been surprised people respond negatively to, where they're like, no, it takes a while and then not really sure why. And so, I agree, like you can have that, manufacturing view of that. So
the last thing, I know we're wrapping, the utilization, fundamental to all this too is I think implicit in some of the stuff you said is inherently organizations view the team, and in particular the engineers, as unproductive if their hands aren't on the keyboard typing code. And I view that as like this utilization mindset of how we engage the team. So they can't follow it into production and evaluate and be a part of evaluating success and validating doing the right things, because that's not how they're implicitly, sort of valued. And so I think if I leave you with that, it's flip your mindset to, it's not about utilization. It's not about times on the keyboard. They are a part of the design and discovery process. It's why I send the entire team out into the field, right? Because that is hurting utilization in theory, but it means they write the right code more efficiently, right? So,
yeah, well, let's wrap it up there. Thank you both, Jason, Cory. Thank you for spending some time with us, sharing your thoughts on culture as it relates to modern product. So again, if you have not had a chance to go back and listen to the first couple episodes that we had, episodes 1 and 2, highly recommend that you do that. And we'll be back with more as we dig into some of the other pillars that we discussed in those episodes. So gentlemen, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you for joining us on Build What's Next, Digital Product Perspectives. If you would like to know more about how Method can partner with you and your organization, you can find more information at method.com. Also, don't forget to follow us on social and be sure to check out our monthly Tech Talks. You can find those on our website. And finally, make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. We'll see you next time.